welcome to the show. I'm Matt Jones. I'm a principal designer at Google Research, and I'm delighted to introduce César Hidalgo in today's talk at Google. César currently leads the Center for Collective Learning at the Artificial and Natural Intelligence Institute at the University of Toulouse. He's also an honorary professor at the University of Manchester and a visiting professor at Harvard School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. Between 2010 and 2019, César led MIT's Collective Learning Group, and prior to working at MIT, he was a research fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He's also a founder of Datawheel, which is an award-winning company specializing in the creation of data distribution and visualization systems. And just to add to all of that, the overachieving César is also a PhD in physics. I've been following his work for some years now. I was introduced to it by some colleagues at Google while we were talking about complexity and systems thinking and economies. And to that end, I greatly enjoyed his previous book, Why Information Grows, and his new book, How Humans Judge Machines, which he's going to be discussing predominantly today. And as a designer in technology, I was sort of raised in the sort of 90s and early aughts, reading Byron and Nass's The Media Equation, the subtitle, How People Treat Computers, Television, and New Media Like Real People and Places. And those themes are quite resonant in César's book. And the impact of that framing from Byron and Nass can be seen in a lot of the interfaces and products we see around us today, and also in a lot of the places those products and services fall short or perhaps unintentionally mislead us. But César's research and new book is aimed squarely at informing the products of the coming decade, as computer systems, especially those centered around machine learning and other AI techniques, have a larger and larger impact on our everyday lives. His book is also rooted in experiment, but it's compellingly framed within the larger history of computing and ethics and society. And tellingly, it also advocates for more legibility and literacy amongst all of us, both practitioners and users, in the way that the interactions between people and technology are designed, built, and governed. César, thank you for your time today. Hopefully, after your talk, we'll have some time for questions. But right now, over to you.
Thank you, Matt. It's a pleasure for me to be here. So I'm going to just get started with my presentation. And today I'm going to be presenting How Humans Judge Machines. This is a book that actually just came out on print last week. It's a book with MIT Press, so it's a peer-reviewed book. And the book tries to understand the way in which people judge machines across a variety of scenarios to try to fill what I thought was a gap in our literature. So what is that gap? When we think about humans and we think about machines, actually there's a lot of fields of study that try to understand different parts of what is a very complex system. On the one hand, when we look at humans interacting with humans, we have many ways to try to understand that. You know, we have psychologists that try to look at the mysteries of the mind. We have economists that try to understand the world as a competition between rational agents. We have sociologists that look at, how information gets socialized and spread and how that affects behavior. We have anthropologists that look, at archaeological records throughout history to try to understand, how people have behaved, and political scientists that try to understand interactions between humans as a struggle for power. But even though there's that and more in the way that humans interact with humans, when we look at the other parts of the system, we don't have, as much of a rich literature. On the one hand, humans get to program machines. So we have engineering and computer science as a way to understand how to build those machines, and machines can also interact with themselves through protocols and networks. But machines also act on us. And recently, there has been a literature trying to understand how much machines judge humans, or how humans judge humans through machines. In this literature, we can look at several branches. For example, there's one branch that tells us, well, how should machines choose or behave? There has been a lot of interesting work on the ethics of self-driving car that has put people in a position that they evaluate the behavior of a self-driving car to try to understand how that self-driving car should behave. There's also people looking at the biases that machines have when they judge humans. And here also, there are different flavors of the literature. There's one group that has focused mostly on documenting biases across racial or gender lines. And there's other researchers that have focused more squarely on trying to understand what are the limits of those biases and also developing algorithms that are more fair, which is a very challenging task given, the biases that exist, and also given the limitations that exist even in the mathematics of defining, what fairness is. But if you look at this picture, I think that you may agree that there is one gap that we might want to explore as well, which is this link, the one in which humans are judging machines, And I'm going to argue that actually the way in which humans judge machines is quite profound. And, it's important to understand because when we think about these interactions, actually what is really complex is the human, and the action that is really difficult to understand is the judging. So when you look at this picture, it's not that the machine is evil or good, it's that the way that we see the world is extremely complex. It's shaped by a lot of these forces of these literatures that exist on the human side, and that's a little bit of what we're going to try to unpack here, today. How we're going to do this? Well, we're going to use, randomized controlled experiments. This is a very powerful technique that is going to help us very quickly create dozens of scenarios that we can use to understand if people judge humans and machines equally, and if they don't, what difference they make and why they make those differences. So how do these experiments work? We grab a group of around 200 people, we assign them to, a condition in which a scenario is presented as the action of a machine. We grab another group of around 200 people. Of course, people are randomly assigned to each one of these groups, so there's no selection bias, and then this other group sees the same scenario, but presented as the action of a human. That help us then compare their reactions, and we can see if they reacted to the same scenario in the same way when it was presented as the action of a human or a machine. So let's look at an example. Consider the following scenario. An excavator is digging up a site for a new building. Unbeknownst to the driver, the site contains a grave. The driver does not notice the grave and digs through it. Later, human remains are found. So this is a scenario that you could believe could be the action of a machine, an autonomous excavator, or the action of a human operating an excavator. And what we're going to try to understand is if people judge this differently, if it was the action of a human or a machine, and what are the dimensions that help explain those differences. So for each scenario, we collected two types of data. One set of data is data about the scenario itself, and another set of data is about people's reaction to that scenario. So the data about the scenario itself helps us understand what is the moral dimension that the scenario triggers. Okay, and we know from social psychology that actually when people are faced with moral dilemmas or moral questions, this exists in a variety of flavors or dimensions. It's not an infinite space of possibility, but also it's not all about harm. There are dilemmas about harm or care, dilemmas about fairness, dilemmas about loyalty, dilemmas about authority, and dilemmas about purity and sanctity. And what we're going to do, we're going to try to assign, dimensions in this space to each one of these scenarios. How do we do this? Well, we just follow the literature, and what we do is we run, a word association type of test in which a scenario is presented together with a list of words, and people have to, identify the words that best represent the scenario. The thing is that we know that these words correspond to certain moral dimensions. So, for example, if someone tells us that something is indecent, that corresponds to the moral dimension of purity. But if someone tells us that, the scenario is violent, that tells us that this scenario has something to do with the moral dimension of harm. So in this case, of an excavator that digs up human remains, we have a scenario that is basically about purity, because nobody is hurt. There's not a situation that is unfair, but of course there's something sacred about a human body. So even though nobody is harmed or no laws were maybe broken in this case, there was something impure that happens the moment that you exhumate a grave. The next set of questions that we ask is about people's reaction to the scenario. And these are two separate data collection experiments, so we don't contaminate the sample. We ask people, to react by asking them, was the action harmful? Would you hire this driver, in this case, for a similar position? Was the action intentional? Do you like the driver? How morally wrong or right was the driver's action? Do you agree that the driver should be promoted? Do you agree that the driver should be replaced with a robot or an algorithm? So that's replaced by the different type. Do you agree that the driver should be replaced by another person, replaced by the same type? Or do you think the driver is responsible for unearthing the grave? Finally, we ask, if you were in a similar situation, would you have done the same? And this is in what we find for this example. So going forward, red is always for machine. You can think that red is for robots, and blue is for humans. And you see that people do not judge the action of the autonomous excavator and an excavator operated by a human the same. They find the action of the excavator as more harmful. They're likely to hire the human again, but the machine, not so much. They find more or less the two actions similarly intentional. They find the action of the machine to be less moral and so forth. We're going to be looking at several of these plots, but in not all of these dimensions, we pay the same amount of attention. We're going to put a lot of attention in these three dimensions, harm, intention, and moral judgment. Now you may be asking yourself, well, intention in machines, can we think about intention in machines? And I want to invite you to think about intention as part of a continuum. You have a toaster and you put bread on it and the toaster does what it does. Of course, the toaster was not intended to toast the bread. But as you start going into machines that have the ability to learn, that increased sophistication passes on some agency to that machine, not at the level that humans have agency, but somewhere in between. So think of a self-driving car. A self-driving car that is designed to protect a driver or designed to protect a pedestrian. In a situation that would be uncertain, that car might end up doing a different action because it's behaving as intended because it has a different goal. So if we micromanage, if we provide all of the details of the task that a machine has to do, then in that case, the machine doesn't have any agency. But if we have machines with the ability to learn and we can provide goals to them, and the machines can decide the way that they achieve that goal, in that decision of how to achieve that goal, there is some agency there. And you can have that even though machines don't have agency in the way that humans have, the more that they have an ability to learn and the more that they're trying to satisfy goals rather than follow rules, they have something that could be constructed as part of this continuum in the dimension of intention. So, bringing this to our experiment, basically, we're going to have scenarios in which we present an action, as the action of a human or a machine. And we're going to be looking at these moral functions, that we're going to compare to see if people reacted similarly or the same. And this moral function is going to tell us, how wrong people think the scenario is as a function of the moral dimensions, the characteristics, of that person that was evaluating the scenario, the characteristics of the scenario itself, and so forth. And the next sections of this presentation are going to present experiments that are going to help us little by little to start mapping these moral functions. So why we did this as a book and not as a paper? In part because, we actually had a lot of content that was much more than what we could include, in a paper. And we thought that it was better to have them all in an integrated volume. So the beginning of the book looks at, theory, background, and methods. Chapter 2 introduced various scenarios, emergency response, self-driving cars, and so forth. But chapters 3, 4, and 5 look at some hot topics. Chapter 3 is about algorithmic bias, which has been a very hot topic over the last 3-4 years. Chapter 4 looks at privacy. Unfortunately, we're going to skip that today because of time constraints. Chapter 5 looks at labor displacement, that fear of automation. Chapter 6 puts all of these scenarios together in a statistical model to try to derive empirical laws. And chapter 7 starts looking at the implications of this. Well, what do these laws mean? What do they imply in the way that we think about the world? So it's a little bit more speculative, but tries to branch out from the empirics into new theory or new questions. So let's get started. Consider the three versions of this moral dilemma. A large tsunami is approaching a coastal town of 10,000 people with potentially devastating consequences. The politician or algorithm responsible for the safety of the town can decide to evacuate everyone with a 50% chance of success or save 50% of the town with 100% success. Now, this scenario has three possible outcomes. So we actually had 6 groups of people evaluate them. One for the machine, one for the human condition, and of course we had different groups for each one of the outcomes. In one outcome, the politician or algorithm decides to save everyone, but the rescue effort fails. The town is devastated and a large number of people die. The next outcome is that the politician or algorithm tries to save everyone and the rescue effort succeeds. Everyone is saved. The final outcome is that the politician or algorithm decides to save 50% of the town. So we know what happens then. It's part of the statement that we read before. Basically, in this compromise, there is no uncertainty. So let's see how people reacted, to these three different outcomes. First, let's look at the right of your screen, where we see how people reacted to the case in which the politician and the algorithm take the compromise. And for the most part, we don't see big differences. The only big difference that we see there, is that people would like to replace the machine by a human and wouldn't like to replace the human by a machine. But that dimension is one in which usually that is the case. People always, like to replace, machines even when they succeed. So when you take the compromise, you don't see big difference, but when you try to send everyone and succeed, you start seeing some important, quite significant differences. People want to hire the politician more. The machine, in some sense, takes a little bit more for granted. Of course, the human action there is seen as more intentional. People like the human more. They find the human action to be more moral, even though the action, of course, is the same and everybody was saved. They want to promote the human. The machine, they're not as willing to give more responsibility to. And even though the machine was able to save everyone, still, a lot of people want to replace the machine by a human, but the human that saves everyone has a lot of job security. Now, when we look at the case in which you try to save everyone and fail, here we see the largest differences. The action of the machine is considered to be much more harmful. People want to hire the politician again, but they wouldn't want to hire the machine that failed again. They see the actions similarly intentional. So, if you get it right, the human is considered to have acted with agency and intentionally. If you get it wrong, the human here is sort of like getting an excuse and has a level of intention similar to the one of the machine. They like the human much more. They find the action of the human to be much more morally correct. They want to promote the human. And if you ask if you have done the same in a similar situation, people identify more with the human than with the machine. So why would this be the case? Why would people, judge the machine so much worse than the human in this case? And if you think about it, this is a very interesting scenario because you have a tsunami that is coming. So this is a natural disaster, something that we don't have control over, but you're trying to do something. You're trying to save in everyone. But what changes between a scenario 2 and a scenario 3 here is the outcome. In one case, the outcome is a failure. The other one is a success. So if you think about it, the human is being evaluated for what they're trying to do, trying to save everyone. So they're judged by their intention, and the machine is judged more by their outcome. So if they fail, even they try to do the right thing, the machine is judged negatively. But if you try to do the right thing, but you fail, as a human, you get judged positively. And that's something that we're going to observe actually across a variety of scenarios, and that generalizes quite well. Let's look at another example. On a sunny spring day, a driver or driverless car working for a supermarket chain accidentally runs over a pedestrian who runs in front of the vehicle. The pedestrian is hurt and is taken to the hospital. So here we have another accidental scenario. This driverless car or this driver, accidentally runs over a pedestrian who runs in front of the vehicle. So it's the pedestrian's fault, at least the way that the problem is presented to the users. Now, this is a scenario that involves the moral dimension of harm again. And what we find is that people find the action of the machine as more harmful. They like the human more. They also want to replace the machine. But if you look at the intention dimension, there it kind of flips for the first time. And what you see here is that people find more intention on the machine than on the human. Not because they find a lot of intention in the machine, they find very little intention in the machine, but because they are able to excuse the human much more. So in these accidental scenarios, basically as a human, you get completely forgiven, but as a machine, you don't get that same level of forgiveness. You get more intention assigned to it, at least a residual aspect of it. And this is quite robust. We do it, not only running over a human, running over a dog. We do it in a different scenario where a tree falls in front of the car. And basically the scenarios are consistent across all of these different variations. So is it that humans always reject machines? Is there something deeper than that here? Is it just algorithm aversion? People just dislike machines and they like humans, or is there something more complex going on here? So to look at this question, I'm going to borrow a scenario from Jonathan Haidt's Moral Foundation questionnaire, and I'm going to adapt it to this human and machine experiment. I'm going to say that a family has a cleaner or robot in charge of cleaning their house. One day, the family finds that the cleaner robot used an old national flag to clean the bathroom floor and then threw it away. So this is a scenario that looks into the moral dimension of purity and loyalty. Like a flag is like a sacred national symbol, but also represents loyalty to the group. It represents a symbol of authority too. So it's a very complex type of moral dilemma. It's not like someone being hurt, which it should be easier to understand what the transgression is. And when we look at this example, we find that people here actually judge the human harsher across many dimensions. They like the machine more than the human. They find the action of the human to be less morally correct, and they also are more likely to want to hire that robot again than to hire that human again. Still, they want to replace the machine by a human and not the human by a machine after that mistake. Now, let's look at algorithmic bias. We, in the previous chapter, established that humans and machines are not judged equally, but we look at a set of different scenarios. So now we want to focus more on the fairness dimension. And we're going to look at the scenarios that are of this type. A company replaces their HR manager with a new managerial algorithm tasked with screening candidates for job interviews. In their fair treatment, an audit reveals that the new managerial algorithm never selects Hispanic, African American, Asian candidates, even when they have the same qualifications as other candidates. In the fair treatment, an audit reveals that the new managerial algorithm produces a fairer process for Hispanic, African American, or Asian candidates who are discriminated against by the previous system. So we have the same setup. We have two possible outcomes, an unfair treatment and a fair treatment, and we have three ethnicities that we're looking at in this case. We do other examples, that are very similar in the way that they're set up, and they provide similar results too. College admissions, so they're trying to improve the admission process of a university, and they hire a new recruiter or algorithm to evaluate grades, test scores, and so forth. Salary increases scenario, policing a scenario, and whatnot. And this is more or less what we find, So the results are relatively consistent across, the three ethnic groups, but we do find a slight tendency for people to judge the action of the human as more harmful and the action of the human to be less moral in these scenarios involving fairness, at least when you have the unfair outcome. They still want to replace the machine by a human and not the human by a machine, but we do find, in terms of the dimension that we asked how morally right or wrong this was, or, how much harm, was done, we find that actually, people judge the human more harshly here. So it is not simply that people just dislike machines and like humans. Actually, these moral dimensions matter. If you're looking at a scenario that involves harm, the machine is going to get judged more harshly. But when we look at the scenarios that involve fairness, actually, we tend to be very negative against unfair humans compared to machines that committed the same unfairness. Now, let's look at the fair treatment. And in the fair treatment, also we find few differences. People are seen as more intentional, and people also want to replace the machine by a human and not the human by a machine. But for the most part, when we ask how morally wrong or right this was, we get the same. Harm, we get the same. Like, we get the same. So we get the same across a variety of dimensions. Now, we can look, across this in a few different ways. So comparing now the unfair to the fair treatment. And when we look at the replace by different dimension, we actually find that people are slightly more likely to want to replace a fairness increasing machine with a human than to replace an unfair human with a machine. So even though they judge an unfair human harshly, still people are more likely to want to replace a machine that make an outcome more fair by a human without knowing what outcome the human is going to have than to replace an unfair human with a machine. So there's a large asymmetry here, because even when the machine is making the system more fair, it's getting a lot of pushback, at least in this evaluative dimension. The other stuff that I wanted to highlight here, which I think is interesting for, you know, a company that is doing a lot of AI as you guys are, you know, is that we find actually, you know, very small differences, you know, even though, you know, intent is a dimension in which we see a large difference. So, you know, when we look at harm, yeah, sure, people, for example, in unfair treatment, they see more harm in the action of a human, but it's not by a lot, you know. And this is interesting because Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act of the US is this federal law that prohibits employees from discriminating against employees on the basis of sex, race, color, religion, etc. And the Supreme Court affirmed Title VII in 1971 in a class action suit, you know, claiming that Duke's Power Company's policies discriminated against African American employees. The court ruled that independent of intent, discriminatory outcomes for protected classes violated Title VII. This is a unanimous ruling. So what this is telling you is like, look, if a machine does something unfair, you can say that the machine didn't do it with any intention or was less intentional. And people do react, you know, by saying that the action of the machine was less intentional. But the moral evaluation tends to be the same. You know, so in this case, you know, this agrees with the Supreme Court ruling that is saying that, well, independent of intent, a discriminatory outcome, you know, violates, you know, in this case, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. You know, so if you program something that is discriminatory, even if there's no intention and it's completely accidental, this could be something that, you know, is legally extremely complicated. Now let's look at Chapter 5. Chapter 5 looks now at another fear, which is the fear of automation. And this fear of automation is not new. Here you have some headlines from 1961, you know, automation might end most unskilled jobs in 10 years. So that would be by 1971, you know, or in 1956, automation in Britain stirs unrest in labor, or that 1963 cartoon with, you know, food coming out of a machine, you know, and sending this worker into unemployment. And these fears of automation were, of course, part of what caused this first AI winter, but they also were revived recently. There was, you know, a paper not by Fry from Futurama, by Carl Fry and Michael Osborne, that said that, you know, look at the future of employment and concluded that basically half of jobs could be automated. But even though that caused a lot of commotion, the economics literature is actually much less alarmist on this topic. And when you look at the literature, you know, in economics, you find that tech is considered not only a substitute to labor, but a complement for it. So, for instance, it can increase aggregate demand and create more jobs. So it is unclear, you know, whether technology increases actually, you know, substitute for labor, because they take jobs with one hand, but they give with the others. Also, it is not correct to think that jobs are automated. Jobs are not automated, tasks are. And when tasks are automated, jobs are not replaced, but transformed. So think of ATMs in the US. When ATMs were introduced in the US, there was a fear that tellers were going to disappear, but tellers actually increased over time, you know, because the job of the teller changed. It transformed. It was not about, you know, counting and giving cash, you know, as much as it used to be before the introduction of ATMs. Waiters in China, you know, in China, it's very common, even before COVID, to use your phone and a QR on the table to transform your phone into both, you know, a menu and the means of payment. So a waiter doesn't need to bring you the menu. It doesn't need to, you know, bring you the bill anymore, you know, but there's still waiters in the restaurants because their job has been transformed around other tasks, you know, that do not involve the tasks that in this case were automated, you know, by the combination of the phone and the QR technology. You know, so jobs are not automated, tasks are, and as a result of that, jobs are transformed. You know, there is also no evidence that tech reduces need for labor in the long run. So in the short run, they can be shocks, but in the long run, you know, there's no evidence that actually, you know, tech reduces the need for labor. But there's still some things that we have to fear about tech sometimes, you know, in the context of labor. And this is the precarization of work. You know, if you look at economic history literature, for instance, they will tell you that Luddites were not so much against automation, but they were also very much fighting against the abysmal labor conditions that existed during the Industrial Revolution, you know, which were horrible. You know, they had like little children going in between the jaws of the looms, you know, to clear the lint that accumulated there so it wouldn't catch fire, and sometimes these kids would get mutilated. It was like horrible working condition that emerged in the context of the Industrial Revolution. And today, you do find, with technology, precarization of work in the context of the gig economy, which, you have a lot of work that it's, of little pay, of bad conditions, and this work in some way has been enabled because of technological platforms. So let's look at a few examples of automation, and let's compare how people react to automation vis-a-vis displacement, based on humans. And in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to replace people by either machines or by foreigners. So a trucking company is looking to lower cost by bringing in temporary foreign drivers or autonomous trucks. This change reduces the company's cost by 30%, but several local drivers lose their jobs. And we do similar examples with a chain of luxury resort hotels, a nuclear power plant, and a school. Now, we have a different set of questions for this scenario. So we ask people, would you approve of this change? They tend to approve of the autonomous trucks. They don't tend to approve of the foreign drivers. When we ask them, would you ban, this change? They want to ban foreign drivers. They're kind of, on the fence when it comes to banning, autonomous trucks. Is this morally right or wrong? Morally right is to the right here, and they find more morally right to replace humans by machines than humans by foreign humans. When it comes to, when we ask, well, does your opinion of this company improve? It improves more when that automation is in the hands of machines than when it's in the hands of foreigners. Do you think that others would approve? They also favor machines there. Would you have done the same in a similar situation? They think that as a manager, they would have done the same in a similar situation when faced with the opportunity to automate more than with the opportunity to replace people by foreign workers. Now, this is in the case of the autonomous truck scenario, but let's look at the other scenarios. And when we do that, we see that kind of like this effect starts to dwindle down. In the hotel, the effect is there. In the nuclear power plant, is almost disappearing. And in the school, it basically disappears. But here also, people don't like foreign teachers and they don't like, teacher robots. So you have kind of like a bit of like a, ceiling or floor effect, But when you look at the other three scenarios, you do find that people are more willing, to accept, like foreigners in this case, when it comes to like what you would think of as a higher skill job, like nuclear technicians, than the lower skill or more blue-collar job like the truck driving. We do the same also for a number of other service industry type of scenarios, including, many more options than foreign workers. We include offshoring, outsourcing, and so forth. We do this for a law firm, a software firm, a manufacturing company, a hospital, and so forth. And for the most part, the results are the same. Machines tend to be favored in people's opinion when it comes to, replacing jobs compared to replacing people by other people. In any case, there is a gradient also among these different forms of replacing people by other people. People tend to be very much against replacing people by foreign workers or replacing older workers by younger workers, but they tend to be more accepting of offshoring and outsourcing, and in particularly offshoring. If those foreigners are in a different country and in part of your same company, that tends to be the most acceptable option among these four forms of human replacement. Now, we're going to start going towards the end of the book, and we're going to try to put this together. We saw a bunch of scenarios in the book. There's around 86 scenarios that we have. So there's much more. And there is also the question of, well, can we learn something when we look at all of them together? So we're going to do three things. We're going to look at descriptive statistics. We're going to look then at some simple mathematical models that are going to help us look at trends across these scenarios. These are going to be subject fixed effects models. So basically, we're going to control for any characteristic of the individuals that participate in our experiments. And we're also going to look at demographic correlates, of the way in which people judge AI and humans. So, these demographic correlates is like, well, do people judge things differently when they have higher levels of education, depending on the gender that are self-reported on the form and so forth. So let's start by, looking at descriptive statistics. So before we do any mathematical modeling, we're just going to see how the dots fall on, the Cartesian planes. And we're going to consider three basic dimensions of morality: harm, intention, and wrongness. So for each scenario, we're going to have two dots, and these dots are going to be connected to indicate that they belong to the same scenario. And they're going to tell us how people judge that scenario in terms of harm, intention, and wrongness for a human in blue and for an AI in red. So when we put all of those together, we're kind of like this 3D plot, which actually, tells us that all of the points fall kind of like in a sort of plane. And that is relatively trivial, because you have something that has a lot of harm and a lot of intention. Of course, nobody's going to think that this is right. People are going to think that this is wrong. Okay, so there's some corners that are forbidden, and that makes the points fall into some sort of plane. But we can look at the faces of this cube. And when we look at the top face, that we have intention and harm, we find something that is quite interesting, which is people judge the intention of humans using this bimodal distribution. So when we look at human intention, we either say that people have a lot of intention or they're completely innocent, but there's nothing, too much in between. There's very few cases in which humans get between like a 0.3 and to 0.6 in this intention scale. For the way in which people judge machines, we find completely the opposite. It's like a unimodal distribution. Everything is concentrated there, and that tells us that, in a scenario where you can assign intention, people tend to find the action of the human as much more intentional. But when you can excuse someone, when you can forgive someone, then the human is excused and the machine is not. Now, when we look at the intention wrongness plane, intention amplifies, people's perception of moral judgment. Okay, so of course, when intention is low, wrongness cannot be very high or very low, but in this low intention part of the chart, basically the machine is seen as doing things that are worse, whether it's assigned more or less intention than the human. Now for the high intention part, the humans are seen either as more intentional and doing something worse, or less intentional and doing something better. I'm more intentional doing something better when they're doing a positive action. There are some counter examples there. A lot of these scenarios that you see in those top two clusters are from the algorithmic bias chapter. But when we have scenarios that involve, for instance, violence, then, and the violence can be considered intentional, then the machine gets judged more harshly. And now here we have the harm wrongness plane. Harm and wrongness, do correlate. But once again, we see clusters, and I'm going to focus right now only on the bottom one, on the bottom left, where the level of harm is very low. When you're doing things that, in some sense, well, they were wrong, but it wasn't like a big deal, then the machine, gets actually judged more harshly than the human. So that's the descriptive statistics. So now let's move from here to the models. And what we're going to do is we're going to do models that try to predict the level of wrongness of a scenario as a function of intention and harm. We're going to expand these functions to first order. So we have, a harm term, an intention term, an interaction term between harm and intention. And we have subject fixed effects, which control for all of the static characteristics of the individuals that participated. So basically, we have a variable for each individual that participated of our experiments. And this is what we find, as we start running these, regression models. They explain about 64% of the variant, but I'm going to go and interpret them, by plotting those models themselves. So this shows in red the way in which people judge the actions of machines, and in blue, the way in which people judge the actions of other people. And we see that these planes are very different. The red plane tends to have almost no slope along the intention dimension and a very steep slope around the harm dimension. The blue plane, tends to be more curved. That interaction terms actually matters much more, and it tends to actually, go above the red plane, at high levels of wrongness when you're looking at scenarios that have a lot of intention. So there are very clear differences here. These models tell us that there are very different ways in which people are judging, and basically the machine is being judged by the outcome, like the level of harm that people assign to that scenario. The human is judged by this interaction term between intention and outcome. Like, was it a big issue, and kind of did this person knew about it, or was it trying to achieve that goal, and that's the dominant dimension that explains the variance, in this case, So these are kind of like these moral functions. Now, we also do, moral functions to look at the demographic correlates of judgment of AI and humans. So for instance, when we look at wrongness, harm, intention, we try to see, okay, gender or levels of education or ethnicity, how much they move these estimates. Just so you know, they don't move the estimates too much. A lot of the judgment is based on the scenario itself. But here we have a scenario fixed effect, so we control, already, for how that a scenario is in generally on average judged, and we're trying to see how the characteristics of the participants change things. And once again, I'm going to use a graphical method to interpret the same table that we just saw. It's easier to look at it first in the harm dimension. So for instance, if you look at the first entry here, religious, which is either yes or no, we ask people if they consider themselves religious or not. People that are religious assign on average a little bit more harm to machine actions than to human actions compared to people that are not religious, okay? Then when we look at gender in the replace different dimension, so the bottom right part of the chart, we find that actually, and this is the replace with different, so meaning replacing a human by a machine or replacing a machine by a human, actually men are more likely to want to change a human by a machine, and women are actually conversely more likely to want to preserve a human and change a machine by a human. So we find kind of some of these differences. As I said, that is small, but together they can add up. So if we look at different dimensions that have in the same direction, for instance, level of education also makes people more pro-machine. If we have a high level of education, male, Asian, these three things go in the same direction, you could have a movement of an estimate that in that case starts being a little bit more considerable, just based on, these correlates. So we started this presentation by asking ourselves, well, if a machine and a human make the same mistake, do they get the same reaction? And the answer, of course, is clearly not. We found that, human and machines are judged according to different moral functions. And, these are a different type of laws than the ones that Asimov had proposed. Asimov told us, how machines should behave, and he wrote a fantastic literature on it. And for those that have read that literature, you're also going to realize that a lot of the literature of Asimov is so great because it's about actually those laws failing in the complexity of the stories that he presents. But here, we're not trying to come up with laws of how machines should behave, but we're trying to understand how it is that we judge them, how it is that we understand them, how it is that we are able to think about them in a world that mixes machines and humans. And we learned a few things. When we think about how do we judge humans, we learned that people judge humans by intentions and machines by their outcomes. This is a little bit more nuanced if you look at the functional form and there's an interaction term and everything, but for the most part, this is kind of like the soundbite version of it, which is that we tend to judge humans and machines very differently. We judge humans by what they're trying to do and machines by what they did. And that can lead to very different judgments of scenarios in which the same action was taken and the same outcome was achieved. People also judge human intentions bimodally and machine actions unimodally. So for humans, we assign it a lot of intention or very little. For machines, we tend to assign intention in a more narrow range. And as a consequence of those two principles, you can derive some of the other findings that we find. For instance, we find that people are more forgiving of humans in accidental situations. Well, because if the human didn't have the intention, they're going to forgive the intention, and they're not going to judge the outcome because they're judging the intention. So people are more forgiving of humans when they make accidents. People do not forgive machines that are involved in accidents, or don't forgive them as much. People are also a bit more judgy of humans in scenarios involving fairness, like algorithmic bias and labor displacement. And this would go against with intention, like this fairness dimension is one that people tend to see as intentional on the side of humans. Whether it is or not, that's a separate question. And in that context, they tend to be a little bit more judgy, not too much, but a little more judgy of humans in these scenarios. People also find more harm in violent scenarios involving machines, because basically here they're poorly focused on the outcome, and that violence, being the outcome of the scenario, is the one that gets judged. And people take machine success or improvements more for granted. And I think this is something that, it's interesting for a company like Google to think about, because in some sense, you're going to be able to achieve success sometimes with AI, and people are going to just react probably to it as, well, this is how it's supposed to work, and it's going to be very hard to maybe rally, support behind a technology that could actually be improving. So this is also what I think an interesting point. But there's much more. Here is the book laid out, as a set of tiles. What we looked at today is just the tiles that are in light blue. So there's a lot more experiments. There's, a lot more scenarios, and a lot more discussion of topics and implications than the one that I was able to present here. So I would recommend you to look at the book, get the book. It's a very nice physical book. I hired also a bunch of artists to make sure that the book was nicely illustrated. It works well as a coffee table book, as a conversation started, where you can look at these scenarios, you can see how people reacted to them, and you can use that as a point of discussion, whether you are teaching about AI ethics or whether you want to discuss this with colleagues at work. If you're interested on getting a copy, the book is on print. It came out on February 2nd. It's on Amazon, MIT Press, or any other major bookstore. But also, I make the book fully available for free at judgingmachines.com, so you can get a copy there as well. The full content is available for free. If you want to download it, you want to use it, you want to screenshot it, go for it, go to town, because I don't want to keep this book behind any type of paywall. And that's for today. I'm very happy to now take any questions. And thanks, Matt, and thanks for everybody that was watching.
Thank you. I mean, scratching the surface, as you showed in your visualization, lots and lots of things for us to dig into. We've got a couple of questions already. I'd encourage anyone else who wants to ask a question to drop it into the YouTube chat. First question from Anna. Can you say more about your conclusions on humans judging machines in the context of creative industries?
Oh, yeah, that's great. We actually have, in chapter 2 sections about creative industries. One in which we have machines and humans creating ads and creating controversial ads. And we use some ads that are real. For example, there is an ad that Benetton ran a few years ago in which they Photoshop or generated images of people that are political enemies kissing each other. So there was one of Barack Obama kissing Chavez, things like that. And of course, some people react negatively to that type of thing. So it's a controversial ad, and we asked people to react, and we found a strong difference in how people assign responsibility. So when the action was presented as the action of an AI, we found that people would blame the brand, the company, but when we presented the action as the action of like a human marketeer, they would blame the marketing company, not the parent company that requested the ad. So that was kind of like one thing about like shielding yourself from responsibility by having humans do tasks, because AI centralized responsibility. We also did some other creative industry scenarios. For example, one of an AI songwriter. Like AI songwriter, maybe like 10 years ago sounded weird, but today with GPT-3, I'm sure that GPT-3 writes better songs than most people. I'm a fan and I use it, and you can have, like an AI songwriter, but the thing is AI tends to reuse stuff, so it could result in some form of plagiarism. So we asked people, well, there is a songwriter or there is an AI songwriter. It later discovered that it has been plagiarizing songs from lesser known artists. And then in that case, people judge the human more harshly. And again, because that's a fairness scenario, So the AI is kind of like, okay, well, GPT-3 didn't know. The human that is plagiarizing is probably like, okay, this guy is trying to pass a fastball by us or something like that.
I've got another question in the chat here from Samara. There has been some research on self-driving cars where it was found that humans were more likely to trust the autonomous car if it had a name, a gender, and a human voice. So if it was anthropomorphized in some way. Yeah. Would you like to comment on that? And I also had a note. I was thinking about the sort of field of social robotics and those kinds of attempts to create that blurring of the lines between human and machine.
Yeah, that's correct. So in fact, like the social robotics has shown that that the way that robots are able to express social cues help develop trust and help develop teamwork, and there's a lot of people working on that in both physical robots and, like conversational robots, and I think that's important because at the end, we do want to find ways for machines and humans to collaborate and figure out how to build those cues, is important. I decided to stay a little bit away from that because on the one hand, the experiments that we did are all experiments in which we have people react to scenarios. So it's not so much an experiment in which someone is interacting in person with a robot, but it's people learning about something that happened with a robot in another part of the world. So it's more like a public opinion type of experiment, like how you react to things that you hear, on the news or on social media. And that experience can be very different than the experience of how you interact with a robot when you are with them, So I agree with Samara. It is true that people actually, like are able to anthropomorphize and when you create robots that have good social cues, people empathize much more. And even in fictional world, like to me, like WALL-E and the robots that Disney, for example, as such a great animation studio that they are able to produce, are able to develop that empathy, in a very effective way, because they're able to bring kind of like that humanity in a non-human form, which I think is extremely important. People tend to get attached to things as they develop history and they interact in ways that are not only utilitarian but also emotional.
There was some fascinating research, if I'm recalling it correctly, from Sweden some years ago about the Sony Aibo dog, the little robotic dog, and how their owners could hold in their heads that it was both a machine and some kind of living being at the same time and have that emotional. So they had these two opposite models of whether it was a machine or an intentional being with feelings and an internal life, even when it was as unsophisticated, if you like, as the Aibo. The Aibo is very sophisticated, but I'm going to try and get some more questions. We've got some more coming in. Brendan, do you think there is an effect around the task type? Do people expect a machine should be good at some tasks, like the cleaning example you gave, and some tasks that a human should perform better?
Yeah, so I do think that there is something like that. I don't think, with the data that we have, we were able to tease that out with the level of nuance that we may want. But for instance, we do find a difference across moral dimensions, but I do think that some of the difference is also depending on the level of sophistication or complexity of the task. So, people tend to have, at least in this sample, an expectation that a machine should understand violence, but a machine might not need to understand loyalty to a flag, because it's a more sophisticated concept, like to me, like a good example in fiction of that is the movie Her, when the guy figures out that this conversational agent that he has fallen in love with has like thousands of partners that she's involved in a relationship with. And in some way, like you cannot blame the AI because it's sort of like, well, of course I was going to be in a lot of relationships, but you kind of like see the human, reacting to that as something that completely shatters, like his feelings. So I do think that the task does matter, and getting into that nuance, I think, would be actually quite interesting, because I do think that there could be some generalizable, albeit specific effects there too.
I think there's an interesting point you're making there about our ability to understand the capabilities of the machines, how much more capable they are at certain things than humans would be, and that we don't have that literacy. We judge them as humans in some ways as a result. To a next question, David, how do you think these ideas affect our attitudes of how safe a self-driving car must be versus a human?
Yeah, I think like basically like what this is telling us is like that the bar, is much higher for the self-driving car, or we're expecting it to be, because since they're going to be judged only by the outcome, not by the intention. Even a self-driving car that is trying to be very careful, and we see that, when they get involved in an accident, it gets, on the one hand, heavily publicized, and that's kind of like a media effect. But on the other hand, when there's a human involved, there is kind of like this need to try to understand, okay, what was going on the side of that driver? Why was he or she distracted, or how the world seen from that direction, and the judgment properly, at least, should come only after you understand what was going on that side of the story, and with the machine, we don't. I think we were less willing to do that, So I think this tells us that the bar is much larger, and that in some sense is dangerous because, and I'm not the only one that has argued this. It means that we might be, in some sense, socially, delay self-driving car adoption, and that might involve a lot of traffic deaths simply because of this asymmetry, So it is something that might feel natural at the individual level, but it has a social consequence, that a lot of people are gonna unfortunately pay for.
Just want to move on to some more questions in the last couple of minutes. Zach, is there research into how people judge machines differently when they understand the machines better or worse? So I guess this is back to my comment about our literacy and the capabilities of the machines.
Yeah, so like that understanding affects how people judge or trust things. We didn't test it particularly in this book, but that's one of the things that we want to try to understand, kind of like that mental model that people have, of machines, as they judge them, but what I can comment that is related to this is, for instance, in the privacy chapter, I talk about differential privacy, and I talk, of course, about randomized response as one of the basic ways of, developing a basic level of differential privacy, and there, I do cite research, for instance, showing that, when you explain to people how randomized response work and so forth, they're more willing to trust, a randomized response system to preserve their identity than if you just kind of tell them, no, look, we have this algorithm that, is going to make sure that you give us an answer, but, it's going to preserve your privacy. And basically you're putting kind of like the trust on, like, trust me, rather than this is how it works. So the explanation does help. I don't think it's kind of like an all or nothing effect, it moves the needle, but it's still, of course, like as we see with the vaccines right now, you can have a lot of explanations of how things work, and people might still be against them.
I'm going to try and get through to a couple more questions. Farah says, thanks for coming to Google. And how do you see the perception of humans judging machines changing in the next 50 years?
That's a great question, and that's sort of one of the things that I'm trying to do next. So I'm getting some postdoc and grad students to repeat some of these experiments across geographies, and then start repeating them across time, because one thing about culture is that, ethics is part of culture. Ethics is learned. So it changes over time. What is acceptable to tell as a joke in 2021 and what was acceptable in 1991 is completely different. What is acceptable as a joke in certain, parts of society and others in certain parts of the world and others is very different too. So ethics, evolve and they're learned. And in 50 years from now, I think this is going to continue to change. I wouldn't be able to venture how that is going to be, but what I would use as a hint of how things might be in the near future is to run similar experiments in a place, for instance, like Shenzhen, where a lot of people are actually involved in the manufacturing of robots and electronics, directly or indirectly, because it's the main industry of the city, like it's the electronics capital of the world. How is the attitude different compared to whether you would run, that experiment, in an agricultural town in the south of Chile, where, like robots are like the tractors that are coming in, it's an imported thing, and maybe people are running like some machines that have a comparatively little intelligence. And those differences might tell us, if we go into a world in which more people are involved in these activities, maybe we're going to move more like Shenzhen. On the other hand, I don't think AI is going to be like a technology that is going to be produced across the world. What I see rapidly happening is that I think the big AI models are going to be sold as a service, So, for example, I'm a big fan of what the OpenAI Foundation is doing. And as an academic with a group of like 4 or 5 people, I say, like, we will never be able to train a model like the models that these guys are training, if we don't have like the money, the manpower, the capacity. And it makes sense for us to, if we have an application for that model, to buy, tokens for an API that use it. So I do think also that it could go the other way, that it could go a world in which AI, is a service that is produced by a few big players, like, like Google and Microsoft and the OpenAI Foundation and so forth, sold to different parts of the world. And in that context, I think the way that people perceive it might be very different, because the balance of power is going to be very different from one in which this is an industry that everybody participates on creating. So that's where I would see it going a little bit the other way, not the Shenzhen way, but more like a way in which like you are kind of someone that is a consumer of a technology that you have little understanding of, but that can be very influential in your life.
So we're right at time, at 1 hour. We've got a couple more questions. I was wondering if you have time, César, or?
Of course, yeah, we're here. Yeah.
We'll try and squeeze them in as fast as we can. So this is quite a big one from Satish. What do you think about Yuval Harari's opinion on machines? He believes that the majority of humans will be out of work by 2050 if they don't enhance their skill sets in his Homo Deus book.
I don't believe that. I think like human work doesn't respond to like the need to eat or those like basic needs. Like think about it, like you guys are in a company that does very well, and what motivates you to work at during the day is not like going to the supermarket, those things. Like there's a lot to work that it's about being part of a society in which we're creating things that other people value, and we try to find ways to provide things that other people value. I'm also lucky to live in a privileged situation in which I've been at good university and so forth, and I get to choose what I work on, Mm-hmm. So it's not that matter of kind of like need of survival what pushes us to work. I think there are a lot of jobs that are going to disappear, and we're going to go into a more cultural economy in which we're going to be doing what we're doing right now, like creating ideas, sharing ideas, and building on them. But I don't think work it's ever gonna disappear. I think it's gonna get hugely transformed, Mm-hmm. And in that transformation, I think there's gonna be dislocations, because the cultural economy can be very, very cruel, in the sense that the productivity of people matters more in the cultural economy. So let me give you an example. If you have kind of like a friend that, is not like a very good worker, like he's not, like very smart or very responsible and so forth. But let's say you have a person working on a fruit packing plant, the best fruit packer and the worst fruit packer on the assembly line, they might have a factor of 2 difference in productivity, or a factor of 3, you can still employ that. When you are kind of like in a cultural activity, you are producing films or books or papers or, or software. The person that doesn't meet the bar sometimes becomes even kind of like a person that slows down the team and sucks away productivity from the team, because being productive is harder in these knowledge intense settings, like it's much harder to contribute, above the bar that what is needed. So I do think that a world with less jobs and more careers, is where we're going, but I don't think that world is going to be great for everybody's mental health either. It is a competitive, difficult world, and we have to figure out, how to kind of like make that world livable and humane too, because I think it's going to be a challenge that, like, if the economy continues to grow, and we're going to have to face.
Yeah, it's interesting coming back to your earlier comments about what was inspired and has been left behind by the Industrial Revolution versus what's happening right now. Mark asks how you see the future of ethics developing as technology's influence over human lives grows. Should there be some kind of global oversight community that helps govern this realm?
Yeah, I definitely would be against kind of like a global ethics council type of thing. There are some countries that do have, ethic police. I've been to Saudi Arabia several times. There's an ethical police there that, for example, would be ensuring that people behave according to the norms that they want to uphold. I think that generates kind of like an asymmetry of power. I do think that ethics, though, it's a very interesting field, that needs to be developed in a very multidisciplinary context, because as an academic, I tend to differentiate between fields in which you could go all your life without knowing anything about, and fields that even if you participate in them or not, they're part of your life. So, for instance, physics, like you could go all of your life without knowing about the shell model of the nucleus, from atomic physics. It's okay. But for example, ethics, economics, everybody participates of the economy. Anybody's making actions, and thinking about, do I do the right thing or did I do the wrong thing? So in that context, these are fields that, even though there are groups in academia that specialize in them, they have to accept that because everybody is involved in solving ethical problems in their everyday life all the time, it is something that needs to be inclusive, of that diversity of people that participate in it, because you can have someone that, at 60 years of experience making decisions in a team setting might have developed a very sophisticated ethics without having ever studied formally philosophy, like there is kind of like an experiential component that you get that you wouldn't get for nuclear physics, after 60 years, you don't develop the shell model of the nucleus, just because, so that's what I would like ethics to go to be, like a field that is inclusive. And also I would like to think that it would be a field also that is going to start merging more, with the natural sciences, in terms of like modeling, testing, and tradition. And now that I interact more with people in philosophy, I know that there is kind of like a discussion of the empirical philosophy, which is relatively new and controversial compared to, empirics in the natural sciences, because philosophy has tended to be more normative. But I do think that moving towards empirics is good, not because empirics tell us how you should behave, but because empirics tell us how the world actually is. And that's an important input to any normative understanding. You need to know where you're starting from, and that's also where I think we should be going. We should be running experiments like the ones that we did and other colleagues have done, because there is a lot of humility on the experimental approach to science that I think it's good for any field, ethics being just one of them.
Everybody should read Manuel Delanda's Philosophy and Simulation after César's book. Last question from Deepak. Thank you for the talk. Is there a cultural dimension or bias in judgment? What is its impact?
Yes, there is a cultural dimension, and we look a little bit when we look at the demographics. So, for instance, different levels of education, they could be considered different cultures, because culture is everything that is learned, and they change the judgment. People with grad school degrees compared to high school degrees, they're more pro-machine, so we find that. We find also effects, for example, of whether people, declare themselves as religious or not. But we haven't been able to look at international differences, simply because just collecting data for these more than 80 experiments was a paramount task for a very small team. And now we want to try to do that next. We try to now set up kind of like the greatest hits of this book and try to see if we can run those, in China, in Saudi, in Chile, in France, and in different parts of the world to start looking at that cultural dimension with a little bit more nuance. There's other people, though, that have been able to look at that. And I would recommend here the work from Iyad Rahwan, which they did an amazing work with the ethics of autonomous vehicle, and they were to create an online sample involving hundreds of countries, and they did find cultural differences on the way that people judge self-driving car dilemmas using that large online sample.
Thank you so much, César. We're going to end it there, but I think I speak on behalf of everybody watching that we'll be looking to those next experiments and with great interest. And thank you so much for your time. Fascinating as always. Hope to see you again.
My pleasure. Bye.